Friends, we've been in this series that we've started a couple weeks ago, this series called I Was Wondering, where we've been really hungry to bring to the surface some of these questions that have been troubling us, these questions that have been perhaps kind of creating this tension within us as we've raised some wonderful questions about who God is and whether we can really know Him. Some wonderful questions about how did God really make the world? Did God bring about all of creation through these 6 days in the Bible? That sounds a little insane. Maybe He used this series of evolution. Wonderful discussions that we've had. And I enjoyed last week. I hope you did as well. If you missed it, I encourage you to watch it online as we talked about how God made the world. What a rich conversation it was. But friends, this morning we get to lean into a topic that I've been a little eager to talk about. One that I think is going to be quite wonderful for us in the season we are in our faith, and especially the climate of the church in the world, especially in the Western culture. This question that we get to lean into today is this wonderful question called hell isn't real, right? It's kind of just this figurative thing that's made up. It's kind of this thing that this kind of boogeyman in the closet that we use to scare people into walking with God. It's not really right. God loves people too much to send them to hell. So maybe it's just kind of this made-up place that's for super, super bad people, but for most people, we're totally safe. This conversation about hell is one that we it's interesting. It's ironic that often hell is one of these Christian words that finds its use a lot in the world that's used in a lot of non-Christian contexts, right? It's this word that you yourself or you've heard other people who get upset. They're like, what the HE double hockey stick, right? And they're like, oh, that person drives me insane. I bet you I know where they're from. Oh, you cut me off in traffic. Well, you can. This word that often we have this reverence towards, and we have this kind of like hesitation to say. We have these kind of things that we talk about, right? But it's this word that gets used often in the world, and it is not just a word that is used in the non-Christian circles, but it's a word even when it is circled around even the Christian faith, where it came from, it gets uncomfortable to talk about. Because questions get brought up that are hard to talk about. Questions like, if God is so good, then why would He send good people to this terrible place? If God really loves people, why would He hide Himself so much in their life just to see them burn? Does God get satisfaction from that? It doesn't sound so very loving. And so what's interesting is that even in the climate of the church, there seem to be these two totally different camps of people. There are those who are really quick to use hell as the central presentation item of the gospel. You got to turn or you'll burn. If you don't walk with God, you bring out your voice. You're gonna go to that place. We have this camp of people who use it, and they beat people over and over and over again with it. But then there is the other camp of folks. I would say where a majority of people lie, perhaps many of us, where we're very hesitant to ever talk about it. We're never out on a date with somebody, we're ever making friends, and we're like, hey, hell, you want to talk about hell? Like, no, that's not something we do. Even when we're talking with friends and they ask us this really hard question, we've even seen on TV, y'all, how Christian music artists will be put on TV and they'll be asked questions. Oh, if someone practices homosexuality, are they going to go to hell? And they'll respond, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. We're asked questions by culture about what we do in life that will get us to hell, and I'm not sure. You should go ask somebody else. I am not sure about that. We're very quick to kind of let it fade in the background. And so very truly we bring into our gospel presentation that God is so very loving and that God loves people just the way they are. Absolutely true. But we leave out a whole lot of stuff. The reality of how perhaps there's disappointment. what life in the way that they're doing is not only going to bring pain and suffering to them in these days, but what perhaps it will even bring them when they leave this world. We don't talk about these things. And even for us who are parents or grandparents, it's hard for us to think about this idea that if our kids aren't walking with Jesus, perhaps where they might wind up if they never know him. It's hard, it's uncomfortable. It's a struggle. There are very well-known Christian speakers and authors who really struggle as we talk through these things that are very, very, very difficult. But this morning, I want to spend a lot of our time answering two smaller questions to talk about this question. Our first smaller question is going to be, what did Jesus say about hell? And the second one is, why did he say it so much? Because the reality is that if you were to just jump online and do a quick Google search about references that Jesus made about hell, you'd be quite shocked to see that he talked a lot about it. It is one thing that he actually spent a lot of his time warning and talking with people about as he went around. And he healed people, he cared for people, he multiplied bread and fish and fed those who are hungry. He did wondrous things. But he spoke a lot about hell. But it's quite interesting to see what he does. Because those of us who are on this side of history, we actually have a very, very different perspective of what hell actually is than those in the early moments, people walking with Jesus. Because hell in itself was not a foreign concept. In the Old Testament, it's really only talked about in a few small moments, mostly in the prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, have very few moments where they reference the realm of the dead, which is a pretty significant word that we'll get to here in a minute. But Jesus is the very first person to bring it out front and center and talk about it in a way that the world had never heard it before. See, the very first moment was in Matthew chapter 5, and it's a moment where Jesus is surrounded by a lot of people. This is the moment of the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus has been speaking and teaching, and thousands of people are crowding in to listen to what he has to say. He says incredible things like the Beatitudes, like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. These enriching, empowering, exciting moments, these Bible verses that we write on sticky notes and we hang in our mirror of yes, that just God uses to fill us up. These moments of salt and light, these moments of talking about the conditions of our heart, because what happens is Jesus makes this twist. He does this with murder, he does this with adultery and a few other things. But he says first in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 22, he says, you have heard it that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to court. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. The very first moment that he ever talks about it. And what's interesting is you and I on this side of history, we paint this imagination, especially if we watch some TV or we've seen some movies, we begin to paint this picture of what Jesus is talking about. But what is rather incredible is that throughout the New Testament, there are primarily two different words that Jesus uses as he speaks about hell. The first one we see for those first several chapters is this word of Gehenna, which is a slang word referencing to a valley just south of the city. Down yonder, down over there. Because what is so significant that we miss on the surface is this reality that as Jesus talks about the danger of the fire of Gehenna, he's not even beginning to reference. He is in ways, but as those who are listening, they piece a totally different puzzle. Because in their culture at the time, they had three horrible ways that people would experience judgment. They would be beheaded. If they did a horrible deed, I mean, murdering someone, something terrible. These three acts of judgment, these three ways of the law being enforced, and then they'd be beheaded, they'd be stoned. We see a lot of that happen in the book of Acts. The third way is that down in the valley just south of town, You'd be taken there, you'd be bound up by a rope, and you'd be lit on fire. It was rare for this to happen. But hundreds of years before this moment, long time ago in the Old Testament, mostly in the book of 2 Kings and some parts of Chronicles, we see this valley used for horrible acts of human sacrifice that other people and other nations do, and it's evil. Evil. And it became a location where those who had done despicable evil, this was not used for just anybody, this was despicable evil. They'd be bound up by a rope, they'd be put in this valley, they'd be lit on fire. And so when people hear these words from Jesus, they're, oh my goodness, we know that if we do these horrible things, that's what's going to happen to us. But what's interesting is that throughout the New Testament, in all the Gospels, this switch begins to happen because Jesus stops using the word Gehenna and he begins to use a different word called Hades. You've heard of that word perhaps. This word that references the realm of the dead, just like in the Old Testament with some of these prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, some of those guys. And what is interesting is that Jesus begins to blend this imagery together of the realm of the dead and this horrible pain and suffering. This sheer cruel act being given to you for something truly horrible. And he begins to blend these words together. And so what happens is that he often uses words like weeping and gnashing of teeth. They'll be thrown outside into utter darkness. These are all these moments where Jesus is using parables and teachings referencing hell. But what is so important for us to understand, is that hell was not made for you and me. Because Jesus talked a lot about it. But God didn't make it for you and me. Jesus actually explains this in the very end of Matthew, verse 25 to 41. He says this is the last moment before he is arrested. We read this a few weeks ago in a different message, but he's speaking to his disciples, and then he says to them, he will say to those on his left, this is when he's giving this imagery of him returning to the world, he's separating sheep from the goats. He says, depart from me, you who are cursed, those of you who've rejected me, those of you who wanted nothing to do with me. He says, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Because we learn in other parts of the Bible, like Ezekiel and Isaiah, especially the book of Revelation, especially the book of 2 Peter, especially in the book of Jude, we learn about who Satan and demonic spirits are. These angelic beings that God made who rejected God. And so God kicked them out. And he created for them a place to live called Hades, Gehenna, in English, hell. A place that is completely absent of the presence of God. Completely absent of the presence of God. Darkness is not a thing. Light is. And when you remove light from a room, darkness consumes it. When you remove every bit of ray of God's presence, you are left with a very spiritual place. In our humanness, we think of a place like this room. We think of this location. We think of this place. But the reality is that in the spiritual realm of reality, there is such a place that God has pushed outside of his presence, has put away. He does not go in. He does not let come into him. He keeps it at a distance. And the reality is that not just is it for all of these angelic beings who've rejected God, but the reality is that Jesus talks so much about it. He talks so much about it because he's trying to get humanity to realize the significance of their life, their days that are so limited, in the preciousness of their soul. That as human beings, we are so much more than just skin and bone and muscle and flesh and good hair. That we are both spiritual as well. We have a soul. But hell is a place completely absent of the presence of God. It wasn't made for you and me. But you see, when Jesus came into the world, he came in ringing a lot of gongs and bells, trying to get humanity to realize something that God had been trying to teach them for a very long time. We've talked about what hell is and what Jesus says about it. But what is so important for us to lean into is the why. May we in this moment be like little children who tug on our mom and our parents' legs and say, why this, why this, why this? Because it is very important for us to see why Jesus talks about this. You see, because it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. This moment where two people who were created in the image of God, created completely different from the rest of creation. We talked about that last Sunday. Two human beings created in the image of God chose to reject God, and what happened is that the very part of what made them different and unique was very shattered and broken. Their soul was tainted and filled and consumed by sin, these decisions to push God away and say, you know what, I got this without you. Selfishness of what sin is dripped and dripped and dripped, and like a small bucket catching the drips of a leaky roof. What happened is that their hearts and their souls became so tainted and filled with selfishness, and what has happened is that this has been passed on through generations. We even read in the book of Romans, chapter 5, verses 18 and 19, it says, consequently, just as one trespass, one sin, one selfish act from Adam, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. Paul is talking about Adam and Eve and then Christ. He says in verse 19, for just as through the disobedience of the one man, Adam and Eve, the many were made sinners, that has been passed down through generation and generation, this inherited brokenness within us, this natural sense of selfishness, this natural sense of ego and pride and arrogance, this natural sense of wanting it our way to be better for us. It has been dripped and dripped down into every bucket behind Adam and Eve. And what has happened is that through them, all were made sinners. And it says in the second half of verse 19, so also through the obedience of the one man, that many will be made righteous. That one man being Jesus. The reality, friends, is that throughout the entire Old Testament, God is doing his absolute best to build a mirror for humanity to look in and to see themselves. As he pursues Noah, he pursues people who are even older than their generation. He pursues Abraham, and those behind Abraham. He pursues so many people, and he builds even a nation unto himself. And what happens is that God gives them, through Moses, he gives them the law, the Ten Commandments, right? And he gives them so many other ways in which it looks like to live in relationship with God. And what is happening is that God is not just handing him a piece of paper. Go do this to be a good person. He's trying to give them a mirror to say, wow, look at yourself. You can be a nice person. You can make some good decisions. But there are moments that are not so nice. There are moments when you get angry and you say things that cut deep into the hearts and minds of your kids or those around you. There are moments where you're nice on the outside just because you want some selfish recognition for yourself. But the Old Testament God is trying to build a mirror for people to take a deep, good look at themselves. And the entire time, he's not tossing them out. Oh my goodness. Through the people of Israel, through the Old Testament, God is trying to build a people that would be like a nation that is like a hospital that would rescue the world. But these people, oh, they were so messy, so selfish. They wanted things their way. Now they time and time again run away from God. Now God would chase after them time and time again. And again. And again. Even when someone like David, someone like King David, who God used to do wonderful things, he took on this giant called Goliath. You may have heard. He practiced tremendous self-control and discipline because he had another person who was trying to kill him, but he believed that God was blessing him, and so he wanted to be more honoring to God than his own self-ambition. And so David refused to kill King Saul because he deeply was convicted that it would be dishonoring to God, even though this man was a maniac trying to kill him. Wow. Someone like David, who is given descriptions of a man who's after God's own heart, a great friend of God even, but a man who would murder his best friend, a man who would sleep with his best friend's wife and then murder his friend, actually, a man who would do terrible things, but yet still would fall on his knees, apologize before God, and be reconciled to Jesus, well, to God. The reality, that is the heart of God as he pursues the world and he brings to them a mirror. And what happens to us, and we do it in our culture all the time, what happens is we have our own mirror of right and wrong. And we don't mind the smudges, we don't mind the dirt, we don't mind if we don't bring out the Windex every now and then and leave it a little caked on, a little gross, because it distorts the image, and we think, I'm not that bad. I'm not that bad. You know, it's okay if I do some selfish stuff every now and then. It's okay if I let anger get the best of me. It's okay if I do these things in private when no one's looking, even though I know I shouldn't. Oh, it's okay if I do some of this stuff. It's okay. I'm not that bad. I'm not like that person over there. What happens is we build up our own mirror of what we believe to be right and wrong. And this is so important for us to realize, because people all the time will ask me these questions of, do you believe this is good or bad? Do you believe this is right or wrong? Is it bad to be this? Is it good to do this? And I always, before I even answer the question, I just ask them, how do you determine what's right and wrong? I'm going to give you an answer, and it's going to be very different than your answer, because I'm about to give you an answer that's not Andre's opinion. You're going to ask me questions like, do I believe it's right for a man to marry another man? Before I get to that question, you need to know that my mirror is not my mirror. You need to also realize that your mirror is pretty messed up. The reality is that throughout all of the Bible, God is giving humanity this mirror. And time again, he tries to wipe it clean to show them, wow, I love you. Wow, you're really missing it. And he doesn't do this just to shovel shame on their heads. He doesn't do this to say, wow, you stink. He doesn't do this just to say, I gotcha. To hell you go. He does this to show the reality of the condition of the soul that we have, that is so bent towards selfishness and so full of sin. And so God gives the mirror, showing them how they are missing the mark. And God is so frustrated with humanity for missing the message that he hand delivers the message. I remember once when Aaron and I were dating, we were young, we were in high school at the time, and you know, I was a hopeless romantic. It was silly, right? Andre in high school, head over heels in love with this crazy girl. And once we got grounded, we didn't see each other for like a week, like eternity, like a week. Could we even make it a week, right? And I remember I wrote Aaron this letter, hello, love, you know, da 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 da, right? And I created this, back in the day when we had the flash drives, right, that were like the size of a small brick, and they had like 10 megabytes of space on it. Right now we have this little thing right here that can hold like all information in the world. But I had this thing, and I remember I put like 8 songs on it because it could only hold 8 songs. It was one of those guys. I'm like, hey, listen to this. It was like kind of like a mixtape of love, right? But it was on a flash drive, and I gave it to her. The silliest thing in the world. But the letter I sent, while sweet and while endearing, it's not quite the same of being in person. Not quite the same of being there with each other. And so when our grounding was up, raced over to see each other, all that gushy teenage love stuff. But the reality is that God hand-delivered a letter to the world. Because he was crazy about them. Crazy about them. And as Jesus spends time with a man named Nicodemus, he unwraps this reality of how he has not come to free them from taxation or free them from oppression or free them from Roman rule or any of that stuff. He's there to free them from sin. Because that matters more. Because that matters more. Over and over and over again, as Jesus has this crowd watching and he's about to heal a man who's paralyzed or heal a person who's blind, he says, is it better for me to heal him, to tell him to get up and walk, or is it better for me to forgive his sins? And every time he forgives the man of his sins, everyone's like, could he do that? And then he's like, you don't believe I can? How about you get up your mat and you walk away? This reality that Jesus is bringing this message to the world that we need to be spiritually reborn. Because the life that we live makes a massive difference for what happens on the other side. This reality is that we are very much enemies of God our entire life until we follow Jesus. In Romans chapter 5, it says this, verse 10. It says, for if while we were enemies, or God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, and how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through this life? We always raise to the next half of like, wow, how Jesus has come for us. Wow, how he has chased after us. But oh my goodness, we are called enemies of God. Like enemies. It doesn't matter if you're born as a pastor's kid. It doesn't matter if you're born in a family that practices another faith. It doesn't matter if you're born in a Christian family that goes to church every Sunday. It doesn't matter. The reality is that until we make a decision to walk with God and have him in our life, we're enemies of God, like enemies, it says. And this interesting word that paints this reality that we're enemies of God, it says that we're the bad guy. And in most movies, we cheer and celebrate when the good guy conquers the bad guy. But not in this movie. Because the good guy comes to rescue the bad guy. Like, what? Jesus is talking about hell so stinking much. So we could realize that we're enemies of God, that there's a spiritual darkness within us that, oh my goodness, is hoarding this selfishness, this part of us that is so broken, that needs to be washed and made new, that needs to be sanctified, that needs to be restored, needs to be reborn. Otherwise we can pretend really well. We can pretend really well and still have a heart that is far from God when we leave this world. And when we leave this world, God's not going to force us to be with him. You didn't want me in this life. Man, I chased after you. Oh my word, how I loved you. I wasn't looking for you to be perfect. I wasn't looking for you to get everything right. I wasn't walking behind you with this checklist of hell. I wasn't walking behind you with this checklist of, wow, you stink. Wow, you messed up. Wow, the last 10 years of your life were terrible. I just want you to let me in. I just want you to love me in return. I just want you to love me. And some would say, oh, it's so unfair for God to send people to hell who don't love him. That these are options. We go to hell or we have to forcefully love God. No, what's unfair is that we could spit God in the face for 80 years. And he has relentlessly pursued us every day of that 80 years. And in the last minutes of our life, we can say, Jesus, I am so sorry. And he says, finally. That's unfair. But you know what? It's not about earning it. It's not about who's better and who's worse. It's about whether or not this thing really inside of you is his or not. Because Jesus, in his very last moment with his disciples, we read one verse of a long conversation in Matthew 25. He says, I'm going to come back. He says, it's going to happen. There's going to be this moment where he's speaking about the return, but the same reality applies for even when we step out of this world and step into eternity. He says, those of you will come to me, and some of you will be like sheep. I wasn't looking for you to be perfect. I wasn't looking for you to get all of life right. But man, you just loved me. And there were times where you didn't, but you came back and it was great, and we did this relationship thing, and there are times where you fell away, but you gave your heart back to me, and oh my goodness, there are those of you who will be like sheep, come with me into paradise. Will be those of you who can pretend, those of you who can reject me, those of you who can put a mask on really, really well. But you're not sheep, you are goats. In the same place that I prepared for Satan and his devils, because you've rejected me all of your days, this is where you'll go. The reality, friend, is that we've got to have a heart that just loves him. That just loves him. What is so important for us to understand are two last things, because this conversation is so important. Because here in a moment, as we sing our last song, we tear down our stuff and we go home. We go back into the world. We go back into having hard spiritual conversations with our kids, with friends, with our neighbors, with our coworkers, all those things. The reality is, friends, is that we must begin to embody a blend of two things. We must be able to embody a blend of compassion. God sent Jonah to a very evil place. To a very evil place. And Jonah didn't want to go. We don't know the story. He jumped on a boat, tried to run away. A storm came in. He jumped off a boat. A big fish took him, brought him to land, where he went on to Nineveh. The reality is, the entire story, God is trying to get Jonah to realize that these are my people and I have compassion on them. Why don't you? Literally, the end of Jonah ends that way. Did you plant this plant that came and provided shade for you? You're angry that it withered. No, I did. That was mine. These are my people. I've asked you to be compassionate to them and run after them. I've given you the gift of love. I've given you the gift of truth, of knowing me. Have compassion as you chase after them. Have compassion. There's some people in the world who are so quick to run away and so quick not to have compassion. Have compassion. But you know what is so important? This blend of compassion and this blend of willing to speak with conviction. Because if Jonah would have wound up in Nineveh, imagine if he would have wound up in Nineveh, and all of us right now in the room, we're thinking of VeggieTales and people are slapping each other with fish. But imagine if he wound up in Nineveh and he begins to share, oh, God loves you the way you are. Oh, you're good. Oh, God cares for you. God loves you. You matter to him. Imagine the words, God is about to send fire and destroy you. Imagine if those words never left his mouth. They likely would have never turned. Because what happens in the story is the people of Nineveh, they're like, oh my goodness, our mirrors have been so dirty. Oh my word, we have fallen into such darkness. Thank you for scrubbing off some of the mirror. We can see the reality of where we are. What happens is the people of Nineveh turn and they repent. And God's like, my kids, The reality is, friends, we must have a blend of compassion and conviction when we speak. When we spend time with those who are far from God, we have been entrusted the message of truth, the message of Jesus. We've been passed the baton. May we share it. Share it with love. Share it with grace. Share it with truth.